Welcome to Changing Higher Ed, a podcast dedicated to helping higher education leaders improve their institutions. With your host, Dr. Drumm McNaughton, CEO of The Change Leader, a consultancy that helps higher ed leaders holistically transform their institutions. Learn more at changinghighered.com. And now, here's your host, Drumm McNaughton.
Thank you, David. Our guest today is Ralph Wolff, founder and former president of the Quality Assurance Commons for Higher and Postsecondary Education. The Commons was founded in 2016 to assure that graduates of academic and postsecondary programs have the requisite essential employability qualities needed for a dynamically changing workforce. Prior to Commons, Ralph served as president of WASC, the Western Association of Schools and Colleges Senior College and University Commission, where for 17 years he innovated accreditation and especially the governance, assessing learning outcomes, and transparency aspects of the process. Ralph is a former member of the National Advisory Committee on Institutional Quality and Integrity, NASICI, which reviews accrediting agencies for federal recognition, and is a founding member of the University Quality Assurance Institutional Board in Dubai. He has served on multiple university boards and consults widely on innovation, quality assurance, accreditation reform, and how new technology platforms can transform student outcomes. Ralph was and still is a leading voice for innovation and accreditation, and focusing on learning outcomes, quality, and transparency. And he joins us today to talk about accreditation and the changes it needs to manifest to stay relevant in today's higher ed world. Ralph, welcome to the show.
Delighted to be with you, Drumm. Thanks for inviting me.
My pleasure. You know, we had such a great conversation last week at the CHIA, actually, I guess it was 2 weeks ago, at the CHIA conference. I just felt like you and I have been floating in the same circles for many, many years, had to have you on the show. So I'm really glad we were able to find some time and you could find time in your busy schedule. If you would, give us a little bit about your background. You've got an incredible career in higher ed. You've done so many things. Tell our audience a little bit about you and, what you're the most proud of in your career.
Well, thanks. And I just say we did have a good conversation, and I'm looking forward to continuing it here and beyond. Let me just say that my career began with law school. I'm an attorney, licensed in D.C. and was in Ohio. I gave that up when I moved into higher education more fully. But in law school, I went to George Washington University while I was in the Army Reserve. I found that I started working with someone who was the first head of the Office of Economic Opportunities Legal Services Program. I was an editor of the Law Review, and we worked together on an article. And for reasons that I won't go into, her contract as a faculty member of George Washington was eliminated. And I came up with the idea with her name is Jean Camper Khan, to create the first ever law school to train public interest in poverty lawyers. And that has been a lifelong interest of mine to serve underserved populations. And I became the director of planning immediately upon graduation from law school and became involved in the development of what initially became the Antioch Law School in Washington, D.C.
Wow.
And my job was not only to write the catalog, work with some amazing people, I was a young whippersnapper at 24, but to see it get accredited. And what Jean said to me was, if it can be accredited, I'll do it. And she and her husband, Edgar, became the deans. And believe it or not, I worked to get accreditation through what was then called North Central, now the Higher Learning Commission, and the American Bar Association. And I moved on from there to become the legal counsel for Antioch College in Yellow Springs, dean of the graduate school at some point, and associate provost at another point. Just to say, but that is indelible imprint on me how accreditation was important, what I learned from it, what the standards meant, how to meet the standards, how to prepare reports. It intrigued me. And while I was in Antioch, I helped set up the first bilingual bicultural education program for teacher training. As dean of the graduate school, I worked with a number of very innovative programs. And then I moved on to become a law professor at the University of Dayton. But I really realized that accreditation was a draw for me. And Patsy Thresh, then called executive director of the North Central Association, called me and said, there's a job open at WASC that you might be interested in. And lo and behold, in January 1981, I jumped and took the job as associate executive director. There was one director and me. And from that point, in 1996, I became president of WASC, grew from a small staff to 21. And I'm very proud of many of the actions that we took at WASC, how we grew it, how we received over $4 million in grants to innovate accreditation. And I believe that accreditation, first of all, I believe I had the best job in higher education working with such a great array of institutions on just about every issue you could think of, general education, faculty role, finance, you name it. And it's just been a wonderful journey for me. And we emphasized, as California became non-majority, diversity, outcomes. I had the privilege of being a negotiator in NEGREG, and then later to serve on NASICI to evaluate other accreditors and to look at it from the federal side. I'll also say I've done a lot of work internationally, where I served over the course of the year that SARS hit Hong Kong to look at the major universities in Hong Kong as part of the University Grants Commission. And I've worked on the Quality Assurance Board in the United Arab Emirates for the government of Dubai for the last 12 years. So I've had the opportunity to both work with and physically evaluate multiple institutions outside the United States, and I've learned a great deal about things that are being done elsewhere that I think could improve our processes here.
Well, that's amazing.
So I just will say that after I left WASC, I also created the Quality Assurance Commons, received another $4 million in funding to focus on employability skills. We can talk about that. But just to say, I've always enjoyed the opportunity to work with terrific people. I've had great mentors, a wonderful staff and teams to work with, and I'm still at it.
You still are, and I had no idea your career, at WASC had been that long. I know that you were responsible, you were leading WASC with many, many of the changes that we see now, one of which we're going to talk about is the need for transparency in education and especially in accreditation. But let's get into it, because there are just so many different things to talk about going on with accreditation right now. I think probably the best way to do is kind of take a look at the state of higher ed and why accreditation is so critical nowadays.
I do believe that it is critical. There was a period of time in the 80s when people ignored accreditation. Now people keep talking about it, and with tremendous frustration. Understandable as it may be, it's both a regulated industry, as is higher education in many respects, and it also has the opportunity, in my view, to innovate and to be a leader. One of the things I believe is so important about accreditation is that it touches just about every institution in the U.S. And I'm speaking not only of regional accreditation, but also those that are not recognized by the Department of Education. There are many professional accrediting bodies, but they touch so many institutions, and the standards that accreditors set have tremendous impact that can lead or stifle change. Accreditation is a gatekeeper for over $150 billion in financial aid. So there's a strong accountability role that accreditation needs to recognize and to administer in its relationship with the institutions it works with.
Yeah. I think you're spot on with that. Accountability is so critical for what's going on with the amount of money that we're talking. But right now, there's collision courses going on in higher ed. You've got states banning critical race theory. You've got accreditors focusing on DEI. I mean, if I wanted to define a collision course, that would be the best way to do it.
It can be, and it certainly is being used, I think, for political advantage. The oversight or the denial of teaching critical race theory and actual state control of curricula, what can be said in a classroom. Let me just say there are many dimensions of diversity, and I think it's really important to understand that, first of all, the country itself already is highly diverse. Many states are non-majority. California being one, many years ago became that. And we therefore have to recognize that there are multiple histories, there are multiple experiences that need to be shared. And a former history major myself, the history that we are told is not the history of the experiences of so many people in the U.S., not just African Americans, but Asian Americans, immigrants, so many others. And I think it's important for us to come to some determination. How do we present history? That's the curricular dimension, which has become a very hot political element. And there are many who feel that any change to the way in which we present the American story is problematic. But there are other dimensions to diversity, and that's who is admitted. We have tremendous issues with the elite institutions being unable to recruit and retain lower-income students, non-elite students who are not legacy admissions. You have University of California, Berkeley, for example, which does, but the Ivy League, which often does not, Stanford, and the elite institutions, which are competing globally. So you have who gets in, and you have what is their experience when they are there, the student climate, and you have the issue of outcomes, the differential outcomes, and the differential trajectories of students postgraduates. So I would say that, yes, the DEI, or diversity, equity, and inclusivity, are multidimensional, and the political elements of critical race theory, I think, are important to discuss, not just legislate. But there are other dimensions, and I see that accreditors are addressing those, and I think could even do more to address the multiple perspectives and the multiple dimensions of diversity, equity, and inclusivity.
Yeah, I think those are great thoughts, Ralph. Let's jump right into, because we have probably about 8 topics we want to get in. We've already started touching on a little bit with the curricular and the political and whatnot. Let's start off with innovation and higher ed's need to reform. When we spoke last week and at the CHIA conference, we talked about the European model and how different that is from the current U.S. model. Can you tell a few differences in how that is and how that could help innovation in higher ed?
I'm not going to say that the Europeans are the model of innovation as much as they are more a model, I think.
Not even close.
It's more a model of transparency, I would say.
Okay.
And I mean, I do think American higher education is both, and the diversity of institutional types, from faith-based, nonprofit, for-profit, 2-year, 4-year community college system, public, moral act institutions, Ivy League, etc. We have the richest range of institutions. The problem I see is that we are underperforming at the second and third tier, which means that when we look at the outcomes, the graduation rates, that we have serious problems about throughput and about academic quality and academic rigor. And I think that's where accreditors can play a very important role and need to step up even higher to this issue. Let me just say that you mentioned the issue of transparency. One of the things I'm most proud of and still surprises me and disappoints me is that because I saw so many other places in the world that accrediting reports were public, that I was able to help my commission see the value of making our team reports and our decision letters become public and published on our website immediately after or soon after the institution was notified. I feel strongly that anyone wants to know what accreditors do, they should see our work. They should see what our judgments are and what the evidence relied on and what the basis for that would be. I'm disappointed that WASC Senior is the only agency. I believe the Community College Commission of WASC ACCJC does allow reports to be public, but none of the other agencies do so. And I believe that it just is a black box, that people don't know, well, why did this institution get 10 years? Why did this institution get less? Why did this institution get placed on probation? And just saying that they were found problematic on standard 2B doesn't give enough information. So I do believe that where the Europeans are ahead, or where they provide the way in which they provide transparency is a way to address one part of the accountability equation, and that is, what are we doing? And is what we're doing publicly available to be reviewed? I'll just tell you a story that I wanted to do a research study on how accreditors across the country were dealing with the bottom quartile of institutions in terms of outcomes. And I worked with a well-known researcher who wrote a letter on behalf of a well-known organization to a handful of institutions in each of what was then the 6 regions. WASC were already public, so the other regions, the other 5 regions, these were baccalaureate degree granting institutions, and asked for copies of their accrediting report to look at how the outcomes were treated because they were in the lower quartile. Not a single institution released their report.
Wow.
So how do we know when an institution has a 16% 6-year graduation rate? Or I know of an institution that has a 4-year graduation rate of 9%. There are many, when we look at 4 years, even 6 years. What are the accreditors doing?
Well, the feds require that you release certain data and it be posted on your website. Is this in reaction to the accreditors not requiring it? I'm a little confused here.
The federal rule requires that institutions publish an aggregate rate.
Right.
And now, up until recently, even in the federal government scorecard, it would be the aggregate rate after 4 year and 6 years.
Yeah.
Now that they are producing programmatic data, they group disciplines together. But to me, transparency is reciprocal. It's the accreditors need to be transparent. But I strongly believe that institutions need to be far more transparent. If I'm going to enroll in an English major or an engineering major or whatever, what is the percentage of students who graduate who have declared that major? What is their salary 1 year, 3 year, 5 years out? There are now a number of institutions doing that. And I believe that's the kind of information that students need that will address debt load. What is the carried debt load? Accreditors are beginning to look at outcomes, but it gets to the issue that I'm concerned about, which is pushing institutions to make much more information available. That information is now available. University of Texas System does it with UTC. Georgia State is an absolute leader. So I ask myself, if there are these institutions that are doing it, that are making an absolute difference in retention and completion, why are we not promoting that? Not so much mandating it, but building ways in which we can highlight. I think where accreditation could play a leadership role is to show who is doing the best work in critical areas that are important to students. And we constantly hear about both accreditors and institutions being student-centered. And I think we have to confront that we're a long way off yet from providing agency to students, and this kind of information gives students much more. Third Way produces this data by major. The Georgetown Center on Equity and Education has done this for years. Third Way does it actually at a much more granular level. This information is now available. In many conversations I've had, faculty are unaware that it's available or simply aren't interested in saying, I'm fine, our graduates do well, when it's really not so much the case.
Well, it's interesting you bring that up because that also relates directly back to diversity and inclusion. I recently had Steve Katsouris on the show. He's the former president at Arube College, which is part of Loyola Chicago. And they have done incredible jobs. They're, first 2 years, they focus on underserved students, etc. The national graduation rate for 2 or 3 year colleges is like 13%, and they're up at 60 to 70% within 3 years. They've structured things, and it relates directly back to what you were saying, is when you disaggregate the data and you take a look at different demographic groups, you can see that some folks are doing well and some are not doing well, and what are the supports you need to put in place. When you just kind of round it all up into one big thing, it may look, everybody's doing just great, but they're not really.
Absolutely. And one could say, well, accreditation is a membership organization, which I think is another topic to discuss. What does that mean? And how do we address that for the 21st century? But in that framework of the 21st century, I think there is too much acceptance that the way we do things is okay. And therefore, there are many institutions that are doing an exceptional job of addressing retention and completion. And it's through the use of data support system, bringing faculty together, reorganizing and reframing courses. Higher education is a state of tremendous change, and accreditation is adapting, I would just say, not enough, not fast enough, not fully enough. It is adapting to the demographic changes, the preparation changes or the lack of preparation of today's students, the distractibility, but now we have ChatGPT and those kinds of issues. But I ask myself, and I've done this for years when I was at WASC and when I was with QA Commons, if there are those institutions that are doing an exceptional job, why do we allow other institutions to get 10 years or to proceed that are doing significantly worse? But that leads me to another issue, which is, and this is one I kept heralding at WASC when I was president, we have to be able to answer the what's good enough question, which is the toughest question at all. When you look at, and I learned this a great deal at the Quality Assurance Commons when we looked at employability skills, and everyone said employers want critical thinking, teamwork. Well, what's good enough? What do we mean? And we accept too much that, yes, our general education curriculum does this, but the data on student learning outcomes for college graduates is consistently that we are underperforming. And so how do we work with institutions to not only say, show us to improve, and accreditation is demonstrably the leading force for assessing student learning, but how do we get institutions to take more responsibility for defining what is good enough for them? And graduating with a 2.0 average is simply not enough. Competency-based learning, there are many approaches, and there are many institutions that are doing an exceptionally good job of this. The same is true with retention and completion. What's good enough? And how do we disaggregate the data and separate out those students who might come just for in a community college for a short-term certificate or program? But that data, again, I would say can be made available, needs to be made available. and then for accreditors to work with institutions to say, you really do need to improve it. That it's not about punishing, but I often feel there ought to be SWAT teams, if you will, on retention. HLC does have a retention academy. These are issues. WASC Senior has a dashboard on retention and completion and on DEI. I think there are things, and we need to find ways to really move the performance of higher education forward, and we need to be far more transparent about what we're doing on the accreditor side, and to really highlight that when institutions are not performing well, something other than a sanction is needed, but there need to be accountability to improve those numbers.
I couldn't agree with you more on that, but it also comes down to how do you define quality? What is good enough? If you're talking about graduation rates, yeah, you can get a 4-year degree in basket weaving. Is that going to lead you to employment? Probably not.
Maybe as a basket weaver.
Maybe, but you also take a look at athletes. There's so much money in college athletics right now, especially with the NIL stuff. The challenge being, these folks come out, let's just say football, somebody comes out, they have a career in football, maybe, if they're really, really lucky, at the top 10% of all, or maybe it's 5 of all football players that come out, they have a 5-7 year career. If they're lucky, what then? Are they prepared for school? It's not the minor leagues for the NFL, although that's the way it's being treated right now. These folks are student athletes. What's good enough?
Yeah, well, I think you've touched the third rail of higher education, which is the professionalization of college sports, particularly football and basketball.
Sorry about that.
And one which even the presidents and multiple commissions have failed to handle very well. Let's start with, I think the first issue is one of integrity. We've seen what's happened when college athletes aren't taking courses. They're given special lower level courses. Others are writing papers for them. They're given special treatment. I think we need to address that. And I do think it is important for us to focus on, well, what are the outcomes? How many actually do go on into professional careers, and for how long, and physical injuries that they also serve. But it is also a ticket. Let's also be clear that it's also a ticket for many students who might not otherwise get into college. And I'm not just talking about football, I'm talking about athletics. And particularly for the issue for men, as fewer and fewer men attend college, intramural, let alone intercollegiate sports can be a way to do that. But I think the broader issue about what's good enough relates to the issue of what kind of evidence do teams look at. And when you talk about the definition of quality, I think we say we have moved from inputs to outcomes. We no longer look at how many books are in the library. That's true, although it commonly gets thrown in the face of accreditors. But it's also true that we do look at selectivity. It makes a huge difference. And I think we're not clear what kind of outcomes do we really want to look at, which I've been talking about, and particularly outcomes around student learning, the power and effectiveness of the general education curriculum, who the engineering programs are serving, the throughput. So rather than looking across the generic numbers of the whole institution, we should be looking at each program's throughput rate. The numerator and denominator do create issues, but it can be done. And what happens to graduates after they leave? And employability is part of that, student success, completing, but I think it's an issue we need to grapple with. And I think there's a great deal of concern about how do we assess learning and allow for multiple approaches to this. But it does need to be done, and we need to be more transparent about it.
Yeah. Ralph, I want to thank you. This is going to end part 1 of this podcast. We're going to take it back up next week when we're going to dig deeper into assessment of outcomes and how do we really define quality with that. Thanks for listening, and a special thank you to our guest, Ralph Wolff. To hear the second part of this podcast, tune in next week. Until then.
Changing Higher Ed is a production of The Change Leader, a consultancy committed to transforming higher ed institutions. Find more information about this topic, along with show notes on this episode at changinghighered.com. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to the show, and we would also value your honest rating and review. Email any questions, comments, or recommendations for topics or guests to podcast@changinghighered.com. Changing Higher Ed is produced and hosted by Dr. Drumm McNaughton, post-production by David L. White.